Today I want to discuss a concerning trend that we see not just globally, but of particular concern in 2024 in the United States. While there may not be a communist party in power by name, both major political parties, Republican and Democrat, whether knowingly or not, have at times adopted strategies that echo the methods historically used by authoritarian regimes to centralize control and suppress freedoms. This isn't about assigning labels, but about recognizing patterns. Historian Dr. Warren Carroll and Mike Djordjevich, a refugee from Yugoslavian communism, identified what they called the 14 signposts of slavery. These are indicators of a society's drift towards totalitarianism. Importantly, the imposition of any one of these signposts is a clear warning of potential government overreach. If we see even one of these signs become reality, it should be a wake-up call that our freedoms are under threat, and we must act to protect them, wherever we are in the world. Today we'll explore each of these signposts, and I'll provide real-world examples from the United States and around the world to illustrate how these dangers are manifesting, and importantly, who has been responsible for pushing these actions forward. Number 1. Restrictions on taking money out of the country and on the establishment or retention of a foreign bank account. Restricting financial freedoms is a significant step towards government control over individual wealth. When citizens are unable to move their money freely, they are essentially trapped by the state's economic policies, unable to protect their assets from inflation, excessive taxation, or confiscation. The Foreign Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, enacted in 2010 under the Obama administration with bipartisan support, requires foreign banks to disclose the financial assets of U.S. citizens. This has made it more difficult for Americans to open and maintain foreign bank accounts. While FATCA was designed to combat tax evasion, it also significantly restricts financial freedom, trapping wealth within the U.S. border where it can be more easily controlled and taxed by the government. In China, strict capital controls prevent citizens from moving large sums of money out of the country, a measure to stabilize their currency and maintain economic control. These restrictions are a hallmark of authoritarian regimes as they prevent citizens from safeguarding their assets against government overreach. Number 2. Abolition of private ownership of handguns. Disarming the populace has historically been a precursor to government overreach. When citizens are unable to defend themselves, they become more vulnerable to coercion and control by the state. In states like California and New York, there has been a strong push for gun control laws that include bans on certain types of firearms, such as assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. These laws are often supported by Democrats, such as Senator Dianne Feinstein, who has been a prominent advocate for gun control. While these measures are framed as efforts to increase public safety, they also raise concerns about the erosion of Second Amendment rights. If private ownership of firearms is severely restricted, it could lead to a scenario where only the state possesses weapons, undermining the balance of power between the government and its citizens. In the UK and Australia, strict gun control laws were implemented after high-profile mass shootings. These laws have effectively disarmed the civilian populace. While intended to reduce violence, they have also left citizens without a means of self-protection, especially against a potentially tyrannical government. Number 3. Detention of individuals without judicial process. The ability to detain individuals without due process is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. It allows the state to suppress dissent by imprisoning people without the need for evidence or a fair trial, undermining the rule of law. The National Defense Authoritarian Act, NDAA, of 2012 included provisions that allow for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens suspected of terrorism without trial. This legislation was passed by a Republican-led Congress and signed by President Obama. Both parties were complicit in this erosion of civil liberties, as the law permits the government to bypass judicial oversight in cases where national security is invoked. Critics, including organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, have argued that this law violates constitutional rights and sets a dangerous precedent. In China, the detention of Uyghur Muslims in so-called re-education camps is done without any form of judicial process. This is a clear example of how the state can use detention without trial to target and suppress certain groups or political dissenters. Number 4. Requirements that private financial transactions be keyed to social security numbers or other government identification. Linking financial transactions to government identification increases the state's ability to monitor, control, and potentially freeze individual financial activities. This kind of surveillance can be used to suppress dissent by targeting the financial lifelines of those who oppose the government. The Real ID Act of 2005, passed by a Republican-led Congress and signed by President George W. Bush, set the stage for increased government oversight of personal identification and financial transactions. While the act was primarily intended to enhance security, particularly in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, it also creates a system where the government can more easily track individuals' financial activities, raising concerns about privacy and financial autonomy. India's Aadhaar system, which links citizens' biometric data with their financial transactions, provides the government with a powerful tool to monitor and control the population. Critics argue that such systems, while intended to improve efficiency and reduce fraud, also open the door to mass surveillance and potential abuse of power. Number 5. Use of compulsory education laws to forbid attendance at private schools. Education is a powerful tool for shaping ideology. When the state controls education, it can impose its own values and suppress alternative viewpoints. Banning private education or heavily regulating it restricts parental choice and can be used to indoctrinate children with the government's preferred ideology. In states like California, there have been increasing efforts to regulate homeschooling and private schools, with proposals to impose stricter oversight and standardized testing. These measures, often driven by Democratic lawmakers, are framed as ensuring educational standards and can also be seen as attempts to bring all education under state control. However, this reduces the diversity of educational approaches and limits parents' ability to choose the best educational environment for their children. In Germany, homeschooling is banned outright, and all children must attend state-approved schools. This is a clear example of the state asserting control over education and, by extension, the values and beliefs that children are taught. Number 6. Compulsory non-military service. Compulsory service, whether military or non-military, can represent an infringement on personal freedom. It forces individuals to participate in state-directed activities, which can be used to instill loyalty to the government or to support state projects that individuals may not personally agree with. The idea of compulsory national service has been proposed by various politicians, including Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who advocates for a mandatory service program that would require citizens to engage in government-mandated activities. This proposal has also seen support from some Republicans, such as former Senator John McCain, who envisioned a national service program that would unite Americans in common cause. While the proposal is often framed as a way to build civic responsibility, it also raises concerns about personal freedom and the government's power to dictate how individuals spend their time. In countries like Israel, compulsory military service is the norm, but there have also been discussions about expanding this to include non-military national service. While these programs are often justified as necessary for national unity and defense, there are major discussions to be had about their implementation. Number 7. Compulsory psychological treatment for non-government workers or public school children. Mandating psychological treatment can be a form of state control over individuals' mental health and well-being. It can be used to suppress dissent by labeling those who oppose the government as mentally ill, or to enforce conformity through psychological interventions. There have been discussions about mandating mental health screenings in schools in the U.S., especially in response to increasing concerns about school shootings. While these proposals, often supported by Democratic lawmakers, are framed as safety measures, they also open the door to compulsory psychological treatment for children, which could also be expanded to other groups in the future, raising concerns about the state's control in personal mental health decisions. In China, the government has used compulsory psychological treatment as part of its re-education efforts in Xinjiang, where Uyghur Muslims are subjected to psychological indoctrination in addition to physical confinement. This is a stark example of how compulsory psychological treatment can be used as a tool of state oppression. Number 8. An official declaration that anti-communist organizations are subversive and subsequent legal action taken to suppress them. Labeling political opposition as subversive and using legal action to suppress it is a common tactic of authoritarian regimes. It allows the government to silence dissent and maintain power by criminalizing opposition groups. There has been an increasing trend in the U.S. to label certain groups, particularly those labeled the far right, as domestic terrorists or extremists. For example, the Biden administration has focused on combating domestic extremism, raising concerns about the potential for broader suppression of dissenting voices under the guise of national security. This includes actions like the Department of Justice's targeting of parents protesting school board decisions, which some argue could criminalize legitimate political activism. In Venezuela, the government has labeled oppositional parties and groups as subversive, using this as a justification for crackdowns and imprisonment of political opponents. This tactic is a hallmark of totalitarian regimes that seek to eliminate any challenge of their authority. Number 9. Laws limiting the number of people allowed to meet in private homes. Limiting private gatherings is a direct infringement of freedom of association. It allows the state to control personal interactions, suppressing the ability of individuals to organize, discuss political issues, or engage in religious or cultural practices. This kind of control over private life is a significant step towards a surveillance state, where the government dictates not just public, but also private behavior. During the recent pandemic, several states implemented restrictions on private gatherings to limit the spread of the virus. For instance, California Governor Gavin Newsom and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo imposed strict limits on the number of people who could gather in a private home. These measures, while justified on public health grounds, set a precedent for government intrusion into private life. These actions demonstrate how quickly and easily such restrictions can be imposed, and how they could be used in the future under different pretexts. In countries like North Korea, private gatherings are tightly controlled and monitored by the state. Any unauthorized assembly is considered subversive and is met with severe punishment. This is an extreme example, but it shows the potential endgame of government control over private gatherings. Number 10. Any significant change in passport regulations to make passports more difficult to obtain. Making passports more difficult to obtain or use restricts freedom of movement. It can trap citizens within their own country, preventing them from escaping political persecution, economic hardship, or simply seeking better opportunities elsewhere. This is a classic tactic used by authoritarian regimes to control their populations. While the U.S. has not yet made significant changes to passport regulations, the Real ID Act, passed by Republican-led Congress and signed by President George W. Bush, complicates domestic travel and could lead to more stringent controls over international travel in the future. The requirement for enhanced identification to board flights or enter federal buildings suggests a trend towards increased regulation of movement. Additionally, discussions about digital passports or health passports have raised concerns about the potential for increased governmental oversight and control over who can travel and under what conditions. Again, in countries like North Korea, obtaining a passport is nearly impossible for ordinary citizens, effectively imprisoning them within their country. Similarly, in China, dissidents and political activists often find their passports revoked or denied, preventing them from ever leaving the country. Number 11. Wage and price controls, especially in a non-wartime situation. Wage and price controls are often used by governments to manage economic crises, but they can lead to significant distortions in the economy. These controls can cause shortages, black markets, and reduced investment, ultimately harming the very people that they are intending to help. Moreover, such controls represent a significant governmental intrusion into the free market, undermining economic freedom. During the recent pandemic, there were temporary price controls on essential goods like hand sanitizer and face masks to prevent price gouging. These actions were supported by various state governments, both Republican and Democrat, as emergency measures. Additionally, discussions about rent control and minimum wage increases, particularly in states like California and New York, reflect a trend towards more government intervention in the economy. Democratic lawmakers, such as Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have been vocal advocates for wage controls, including a $15 minimum wage. While these measures are often justified on social justice grounds, they can lead to unintended consequences, such as reduced housing supply or increased unemployment, which could exacerbate the very problems they aim to solve. In Venezuela, the government's implementation of strict price controls led to severe shortages of basic goods, contributing to the country's economic collapse. These controls, intended to make goods more affordable, instead disrupted supply chains and drove inflation, pushing millions into poverty. Number 12. Any kind of compulsory registration with the government of where individuals work. Compulsory registration of employment with the government allows the state to monitor and control the workforce. It can be used to enforce conformity, suppress dissent, and limit economic freedom by dictating where and how people work. This kind of control over labor is a key feature of totalitarian regimes. While the U.S. does not currently have compulsory work registration, discussions about implementing a universal basic income or similar programs often include proposals for more comprehensive government tracking of employment status. For instance, to qualify for benefits, individuals might be required to register their employment or unemployment status with the government. This idea has been supported by progressive Democrats like Andrew Yang, who advocated for a universal basic income during his presidential campaign. While such programs are often framed as social safety nets, they could also pave the way for increased governmental control over individual work choices. In countries like China, the government tightly controls labor through its household registration system, known as Hukou, Hukou, which determines where citizens can live and work. This system is used to control internal migration and labor distribution, effectively limiting individuals' freedom to control their place of residence and employment. Number 13. Any attempt to restrict freedom of movement. Restricting freedom of movement within a country is a clear violation of personal liberty. It allows the government to control where people live, work, and travel, which can be used to suppress dissent, enforce economic policies, or maintain political control. This kind of restriction is a common feature of authoritarian states. The recent pandemic saw unprecedented restrictions on movement within the United States and elsewhere. Quarantine orders, travel bans between states, and mandatory stay-at-home orders were implemented across the country and elsewhere, often with little regard for individual rights. Both Republican and Democratic governors, including Ron DeSantis and Gretchen Whitmer, enforced these measures, showing how easily freedom of movement can be curtailed in the name of public safety. These actions, while temporary, set a concerning precedent for future government control over movement. In China, the government's use of health codes during the pandemic restricted movement based on an individual's health status. This system, which assigned a color code to each citizen's smartphone, determined where they could travel and whether they could enter public spaces. The technology behind this system could easily be reproduced for broader surveillance and control of the population. Lastly, number 14. Any attempt to make a new major law by executive decree. Governing by executive decree bypasses the legislative process, centralizing power in the hands of a single individual or a group of individuals. This undermines the system of checks and balances that is fundamental to a democratic society, paving the way for authoritarian rule. In recent years, there has been an increasing reliance on executive orders to implement significant policy changes. For instance, President Biden's executive orders on issues such as student loan forgiveness and pandemic response, as well as President Trump's orders on immigration and trade, have bypassed the traditional legislative process. While executive orders are not new, their growing use to enact major policies without congressional approval raises concerns about the erosion of democratic governance. This trend, seen under both Republican and Democratic administrations, reflects a shift towards governance by decree rather than by law. In countries like Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro has repeatedly used executive decrees to bypass the National Assembly and implement policies unilaterally. This has allowed him to maintain power despite significant opposition and has contributed to the country's slide into authoritarianism. As we've seen, the 14 signposts are not just theoretical warnings. They are realities that are unfolding in the United States and around the world. While not all of these developments have fully taken root, the direction in which we are heading should give us pause. This is not about fear-mongering. It's about being vigilant and recognizing the patterns that history has shown us lead to tyranny. We must remember that freedom is not lost all at once. It is chipped away gradually, often under the guise of safety, security, or the greater good. Whether through legislation, executive action, or social pressure, the erosion of our liberties is a very real threat. It is up to us to remain informed, to speak out, and to hold our leaders accountable, regardless of which party is in power. The preservation and protection of freedoms depends on our willingness to recognize and resist any and all attempts to erode our rights. Let us not be complacent, but instead, let us be vigilant in safeguarding the liberties that are hard-won and are all too easily lost.